We got a really distinguished panel here for the second meeting, and hopefully easier to understand than the earlier panel. I don't know if everybody followed Joe's math or not, but it's kind of hard to keep up with. It reels it off in your head. We got 4 panelists today. We got some really good people. We have Paul DeSaw from the FCC. I think everybody here probably knows Paul. He's the chief of the of OSP. Before that, he was with McKinsey and Company and has a doctorate in theoretical physics. I don't know how he did that with his aversion to math, but he did it. It's a miracle. We have Mike Mandel. It's a real treat to hear him speak. You'll enjoy it, I think. He's the former chief economist of Business Week. To be teaching or expressing business in that format, and economics in that format for that long, I think you'll really enjoy what he has to say, and I know I'm excited to learn a few lessons about how to convey economics well to a general audience. We have Mike Rollins with Citi. I always try to get Mike Rollins to our events, and the reason is that I was on the panel with him one time and he agreed with what I said. But the other reason is that a lot of times in these policy symposiums that people do, we treat communications firms a bit like a chew toy. And what Mike brings to the debate is the clear truth that these are businesses that write very large checks and expect returns. We don't play with these. You play with the people, you end up perhaps with some very severe capital and innovation issues. And Mike will help us with that. And he's managing director at Citi Investment. We also have Phil Weiser, who works in a little house down the street here. He's a senior advisor to the National Economic Council Director for Technology, Innovation, and Competition Policy. He's done stints at the Department of Justice as an Assistant Attorney General. Many of us know Phil, or at least appreciate Phil for what he's done out at the University of Colorado. He's really created a top-rated, top-ranked, helpful policy organization in an academic setting. There are many policy organizations in academic settings, but I don't think any compete with the level and quality of output that he's managed to achieve there. We will start, I guess, at the end with Michael Mandel and work our way this way, and then with Phil.
Can you get mine down?
Sure.
Slides up. Good morning, everyone. I assume it's still morning here. I'm going to start with my disclaimer. I've got disclaimer envy. My disclaimer is that, let's make sure, okay, great. My disclaimer is that I don't give stock tips. And if I give any stock tips, I'm not responsible for the implications of them. So I want to say that I really, really enjoyed Blair's presentation because I love seeing pictures of the pre-Bloomberg Business Week. It looks so much better than than the current version, at least in my opinion. I've been writing about the economics of the communication industry on and off for years at this point. Going back into the mid-90s, I'm actually in the process of revising my textbook at this point. I'm actually going to put in an intro textbook. I'm going to put in a section about economics, communications industry economics, simply because it's so important that I think that every young economics student should know something about it. Kind of drives some of the professors crazy because they don't like that dose of reality, but it's so integral to all of their lives that it's important that they know. One of the things that I'm most concerned with, generally, is measuring the economic contribution of innovative industries. And Blair said, well, you can't measure it. We've got to measure it. We have to be able to measure it because people think about numbers. When they think about policy, it's important to have some data that actually corresponds to what's going on in the real world. The problem is that the economic statistics system, the data lags, the concepts lag, and we're left in a situation, well, you know, we have the proposed rules of the road for internet openness. How will we know if they're successful if we can't measure the economic contributions of the communications sector? We have to know what we're aiming for. We have to know what our goals are. We have to be able to measure innovation, jobs, investment. I've recently written about jobs in the communications boom for the Progressive Policy Institute. I've recently written about counter-cyclical regulatory policy. So this morning I'm going to pick up on investment. What I'm going to talk about is part of our ongoing innovation project at the Progressive Policy Institute. What we're doing is we're taking the big picture on innovative industries, trying to assess what the economic contribution is of communications, biosciences, education, energy, looking at it and asking the question, are these industries doing what we want? How can we tell? How can we get beyond the conventional statistics to actually measure the real contribution? Can we see it in the data? And I was also pleased to see that Blair, I don't think this was intentional, quoted something that I wrote about the communications being driving the next boom, which I think is really important. And how do we know it's happening? And here's the problem. The problem is that the national income statistics, well, they were actually designed in the 1930s, and then over the years that they've been revised. I think of them as sort of still being stuck mostly in the 1970s. In terms of the communications industry, they haven't kept up with the shift to videos. We have some data about household broadband connection that goes into the data. And I love that chart that Blair had about the relative size of the business sector versus the household sector. And the fact is that the GDP accounts do a horrible to almost negligible job of tracking broadband use by business, and it doesn't really show up directly in GDP. We're not seeing it. There's more problems here. One problem that I want to flag that I'm not going to talk about extensively is that you can assume our trade data is supposed to be quantities, imports and exports. Obviously, there's an amazing amount of data flowing cross-border at this point. And if you think about what businesses consume and use enormous amounts of cross-border data. We're not tracking it correctly well, really hardly at all in the GDP accounts, and that means we are guaranteed that we're missing some of the major contributions to globalization of the communications sector. I'm not going to go into this extensively here, but we need to assess, I sort of say, the price of global connectivity. We need to assess the value of global connectivity to truly understand what communications is contributing. And when Blair put up that very nice chart of Boeing being able to coordinate with all of its foreign suppliers on the Dreamliner, what it was talking about was this linkage of U.S. companies with foreign companies, foreign suppliers, foreign R&D facilities of all sorts, and you can be absolutely sure that whatever the size of that contribution is that it's not showing up in the economic data, and that it should be. And that's part of what we're looking at. But for today, what I'm going to talk about is telecom investment. And in particular, the undercounting of telecom investments is extremely important relative to what's being discussed in terms of, I need to sort of say this word, I hate to say it, net neutrality. Okay? Part of what the debating point is investment as well as jobs. And, well, we want to be able to measure it correctly. And so I'm going to sort of telegraph my point here, is that is that the measured price indexes for communications equipment decline much slower than they should, or than they do in the real world. And the implication is that real investment by the telecom industry, communications industry, is being undermeasured. And let me just back up 1 second. Right, when you measure investment, there's two ways to measure it. One is in terms of dollars, and the other is in terms of the real services that that investment provides. If you're in a situation like telecom, where there's a rapid innovation and the prices are falling, what happens is that the same dollar today can buy, tomorrow can buy a lot more speed, a lot more bandwidth, a lot more communications capability. And so what we should be doing is we should be measuring, when we look at investment in this industry, we should be measuring real investment and not the pure dollar investment in order to get a true idea of what's happening. And the problem, though, is that for historical reasons, which I could explain, but I sort of don't really want to go into at this point, is that the government has not done a great job of tracking price declines, say, of a router or of the system as a whole, in terms of being able to generate additional capabilities. And this has a very big implication. Okay, and let's see, everybody should be able to see this table. Okay, and this table measures, this is official data from the BEA, this is the real growth in the capital stock of equipment and software adjusted for inflation from 2004 to 2009. I happen to pick these years, it's 5 years, could have been 10 years, it's the same no matter what. And we go up and we look here, and this is not rates of growth, this is just the total change. So mining is up at the top. Well, okay, you know, we're investing in oil, okay, healthcare and so forth, and you sort of go all the way down. Construction had a 21% gain in its capital stock between 2004 and 2009, and then core telecommunications is down here at 14%, just below wholesale trade and just below the average for the entire business sector, slightly above fishing and farming. Okay, what the heck is going on here? Okay, well, what's going on here, of course, is that the government is not correctly adding, the government statisticians are not correctly adding in all the gains in capability of the equipment that's being put in by the telecom companies in terms of generating broadband, and therefore missing the real gains in investment. So, for example, according to the BEA, the price of comparable communications equipment dropped 27% from 2004 to 2009. That translates into a 38% gain in implied efficiency, half of what computers showed over the same period. Now, I'm a simple guy. This is what comes from having been a journalist for so long. Okay? I believe the evidence of my eyes. If the data contradicts the evidence of my eyes, I happen to believe, and usually this turns out to be, there's a problem with the data. So if you think about it, over the period 2004 to 2009, there's been a heck of a lot more innovation in communications than there has been in computers. You can do a lot more. It's been more transformative. What this means is that the communications industry is not getting credit for a vast improvement in capabilities relative to dollar spending, and this problem is worse over the long run. If you look at the price drop, what you see, the implied efficiency gain for new communications equipment over the last 10 years is only 78%. What does this mean? What it means is that any attempt, I mean, Blair was kind of alluding to this, any attempt to go use government data to sort of assess the economic impact of the communications sector, if you use the data as it's given to you, you're going to end up underestimating investment, you're going to end up underestimating economic impact, a lot of other things that go into this too. So part of what we're doing as an ongoing project at PPI is we're examining the contribution of communications to growth, productivity, and trade performance, and we're trying to get beyond the limitations of the government data. Now this is one of those cases, and I forgot who said it earlier, where 80% of the way in the right direction is better than trying to be absolutely precise, because we know that this stuff is way off and we know what direction is the right direction and we can make adjustments. So just to kind of conclude, if you want to be on our mailing list as we kind of go ongoing on this, feel free to kind of give me, you know, your card or whatever, because we're going to have a series of papers come out on this and related topics. Thanks.
Man has a good internal clock. Dead straight on 12 minutes. Mike Rollins is next. I enjoyed your comments. It's interesting because which would be a better world if we increased capital expenditures in the industry by 20% next year, or we figured out how to build 100 megabits to every home for $100 total? Which would you prefer? In one case, you have this dramatic reduction in investment in telecom, and the other you have this big increase in investment in telecom. Of course, the economists would certainly say, I want the whole thing for $100. So Mike's point that it's investment is not necessarily what you count, what the bean counters count in the accounting offices. Mike, teach us a lesson.
Well, thanks. Actually excited because I think this is the first time where my upfront disclosure might be shorter than anyone else on the panel that I've been with. And so I'll just say they're available at the registration desk. And there's a full page there for you. I thought it'd just be helpful to just briefly review what's going on in the industry, what's happening with investment and the role from a high level that regulation plays. And then thirdly, what the mood from investors is right now in terms of investment and what investors are thinking about. From an industry perspective, it's really interesting. As you look at the last, if you want to take it 5 to 7 years, industry revenue from a telecom perspective really hasn't moved much. And it's kind of amazing because if you think about all of the capabilities that we now have, whether it's in the home or on the go, the actual amount of end user spending within telecom has been somewhat flat at about $350 billion. And the biggest challenge for this industry, I think, is to grow revenue in a meaningful way. There are some recent positives, though. We're starting to see private sector jobs grow, and we see usually the enterprise sector within telecom benefit on a lagging basis to that. We saw in the third quarter results, for the first time in, I think, almost ever, that the benefits of mobile broadband outpaced this historic cannibalization of voice that we've been seeing. So mobile revenue growth on a service revenue basis actually accelerated in the third quarter from an industry perspective. And of course, there's a lot of opportunity with the increasing number of applications and devices. It's just sort of amazing to think about it today. I was in an elevator riding down with a medical company, a company that manages a bunch of doctors around the country. Even a company like that is actively thinking about how to deploy mobile applications for their doctors, whether it's for healthcare records or managing what they're doing. And so you're just seeing the opportunities in terms of what you can do with this stuff just come from all different angles. But at the same time, I mentioned the biggest challenge is grow revenue. And so the question is, why is that? And I think it comes from a simple principle that's been maybe somewhat long in duration to evolve, which is that all forms of communication are actually competing with each other. Years ago when I first started in the industry, it was all about wireless companies just competing for their share of voice. But it wasn't really about taking share from wireline, which clearly now, with over 31% of homes cutting the cord, it's all about wireless versus wired voice. And I think the same is going to be true for broadband over time. And the same is true in terms of now people might use messaging or instant messaging in place of a conversation. And so when you think about the sector, all forms of communication are competing with each other, and there are a lot of companies with assets out there that are competing within our industry. From an investment perspective, we've seen investment be roughly flat, around $50 billion a year, half of which is coming from wireless. And really the push is fiber, more broadband speeds, whether it's to businesses or homes, and mobile broadband. And that's where the bulk of the investment is going towards. And within that context, I think regulation plays a very meaningful role over the long term in trying to understand where things are going, because it does affect investment decisions. We could talk about whatever you like on this basis later, during the Q&A session, but it does play a role. And I think the most important things, I know I'm not going to shock anyone when I say this, is visibility and predictability. One of the benefits I have in my job is not espousing what the right regulatory view is or what the right policy is, but trying to understand what that means for fundamentals and ultimately stock prices. And so, we look at this very closely and spend a lot of time in DC because of that. I think within this context, as you look at what investor sentiment is that's out there, you look at the stock prices, for example, and you look at different types of metrics, and it's our view, and it's, corresponds with the conversations that we have with the buy side, that there still is a bearish sentiment for the telecom sector. And ultimately, as I mentioned before, the biggest concern, if I had to sum it up, is that what are diminishing marginal returns from putting new assets out there, that $50 billion a year, what should be a diminishing marginal return for these companies can quickly turn into a negative marginal return given the amount of competition that sits underneath the hood, and in terms of what that means for pricing. Because again, if you look at the intensity of what is used in this country, whether it's wired voice historically, wireless voice historically, whenever I have a chance to come to some of these roundtables, we'll see a listing of ranks and where the U.S. sits. And I think the one thing on a penetration basis that's missed, and I think it was talked about in some of the earlier presentations, is the incredible intensity of what's being used. And I think that's where this industry has tremendous opportunity, but also from an investor perspective, people want to understand how to get a return on all that capital is deployed. Ultimately, it's a very competitive industry, and I think that's why CapEx, regardless of the exact regulatory policies, will continue to remain fairly robust for this sector. It'll be driven by competition, but regulation will, I think, clearly play a role in terms of how the dollars are spent, what kind of innovations, come in certain segments of the industry. And so we'll keep watching that as we move forward. So, with that, I just, want to say, I think from an industry perspective, there's a lot of opportunity moving forward, especially with the way communications is just growing in terms of capabilities, whether it's in the home, in the business, or on the go. And, from our perspective, it's really just watching to see, which are the winners and losers within the sector and how it all works itself out. And so with that, I'll turn it back.
Thank you. That was great. All right. Dr. Desai from the FCC.
I'm nervous to get up there, so you'll leave the stage, please. Great, thank you. Thank you very much, George. As a former consultant, I have a visceral hatred of PowerPoint, so I'm just gonna talk a little bit. First, let me thank the Phoenix Center for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here, although I'm hoping that if I insult economists and George lunges at me, Phil will come to my defense. I should give the same disclaimer as John Baker gave before, which is these are all personal opinions, not commission opinions. Anything of substance is probably open at the commission at the moment, so I'm going to stick to just process and no substance at all. The topic for today is promoting investment, innovation, and jobs. And so what I thought I would do is just give a few reflections. I've only been at the Commission for 18 months. I just thought I'd give a few personal reflections on how we're trying to think about that. I guess the good thing about it is it's an objective that everyone agrees about. So no one says, I'm against innovation and I'm against investment, I'm against jobs. Everyone's for the objective. So at least there's one less thing to disagree about. We all agree on the objective. That means it's really a fight about the means, not the ends. Right? The bad news is the fight about the means is really difficult. Right? I mean, unless you're a a libertarian, and so you think anything the government does is probably going to be bad for jobs and innovation and investment, or you're a fundamentalist statist and you think everything the government does is going to be great for jobs and innovation and investment. If you're at neither of those poles and you're somewhere in the middle, it's really difficult to know, as you're thinking about policies and what to do, what are the implications going to be on jobs and innovation and investment in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term. Why is it difficult? I thought I'd just say a couple of words about why is it difficult to do that. I think the first thing is there's no clear causality or counterfactual, right? So if the Commission or any government agency does something, it's not really clear the causality of that, what actually the implications, what are the first order implications, what are the second order implications. As George was saying this morning on the Economist panel, it's really difficult to know what's going to happen. Right, so you have to try your best, but it's not an easy thing. There's also no counterfactual, right? It's if you did something else, what would have happened if the Commission had done, the third way on net neutrality? To pick a random example, some people said the sky would fall and the industry would collapse and everything would be a total disaster. Right? Would it have been true? Not true? Hard to tell. Right? There's no counterfactual. The second piece, just to pick up a little bit on what Michael was saying, is that there are no clear metrics. And it's great, I think. I mean, it seems like a very ripe time to be trying to improve the metrics on all the dimensions. If you think about jobs, jobs is probably the clearest. There's at least a metric probably within the industry. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps data. It's a little bit lagging. But to Blair's point before, to the extent that many of the things that we're doing with respect to broadband, for example, are really foundational actions that will have impacts on jobs in other industries, education, healthcare, and so on. How do you think about the job implications of what's going on in the telecom sector for all those other industries? Very, very difficult. Similarly on innovation, who knows what the metric for innovation is? R&D spending, probably not really very effective. Lagging indicator probably doesn't really correlate very well with the propensity of teenagers to sit in garages in Silicon Valley and invent cool stuff. It's not really clear how you think about innovation in any kind of quantitative metric sense. Even investment, right, as Michael was saying, the pure even capital stock is difficult, but even if you step back and you think about when we say we're trying to encourage investment, what does that mean? People watch stock prices, to Mike Rollins' point, people watch equity investments, people watch ability to raise debt, people watch capital expenditure, people watch incremental capital expenditure versus last year's capital expenditure. You think about statistics like the private equity industry at the moment has almost $500 billion of unspent money. So what would it take to attract some of that investment into the sector? Many metrics to think about, not really clear what it means to say we're trying to optimize investment. Another reason it's hard is there are obviously trade-offs, right? There are obviously trade-offs between jobs and innovation and investment. So you think about the secular trend, for example, in the wireline telcos, which is reductions in employment, right? I mean, the business is just shifting from wireline to wireless, as Mike was saying. That's leading to just secular declines in employment of the telecom companies. On the other hand, that increases the margins on the wireline business. It increases the free cash flow. It increases their ability to invest. So bad for jobs, good for investment. How does that play out, right? How do you think about doing that? How do you think about innovations, for example, on over-the-top video, where that kind of innovation may attack the core cash flow in the cable sector and make it hard to invest in the next generation of networks? Right? Trying to take into account all those trade-offs between different participants in the sector is a very, very difficult thing. Finally, I would say one of the things that I've noticed a lot, just being sort of new to DC, is the kind of asymmetry of viewpoints that are reflected, at least in the Commission, right? So it's relatively easy to take into account what big players who are sort of, have resources to be in DC and are used to being in DC think about our policy's implications on jobs and innovation investment. It's much harder to think about the implications for the two-person entrepreneurial shop, someone who doesn't have the resources to have a DC guy. It's very hard to think about the implications on small businesses, for example, who don't really, even though they're diffuse and they may be really the engine of job creation, don't really have a concentrated single number that says, hey, we've just increased our employment by 2,000 people this quarter. It's very hard, obviously, to think about the companies that don't exist yet, right? So who's looking out for the next Googles? Who's looking out for the next Facebooks? We've got to, as we think about these policies, try and not just take into account the people who seem very, very comfortable in the corridors of the FCC. So that being said about how it's difficult, what do we try and do about it? So I'll give you just sort of four things, and some of these echo what John Baker said earlier about how we're trying to think about this at the Commission. The first thing is, it makes sense to take the easy wins. So if I think about, for example, a transaction like the Frontier Verizon transaction, right, here's an asset, set of lines that Verizon really doesn't fit with their strategic plan to invest in, set of lines that Frontier is extremely excited to invest in, absolutely makes sense to have that transaction be approved and go ahead as quickly as possible. Something like the Harbinger transaction, I'll disagree a little bit with you, George, which is I think, if someone comes and says, I've raised a bunch of private capital and I would really like to invest it and try and be a new entrant into the wireless sector, I'm going to try and raise that money in the private markets, I'm going to hire a bunch of people, I'm going to give it a crack, maybe I'll succeed, maybe I'll fail. I think for the Commission to say, okay, go have a go, seems like a pretty reasonable thing, seems like a pretty quick win. So the first thing is take the easy wins. The second thing is I think we have a responsibility to use the resources that we direct in a responsible way. So I think the Universal Service Fund, for example, that Blair was talking about, that's a direct pool of money that the Commission essentially controls. We have a responsibility to use that in a way that will optimize jobs and innovation and investment. Spectrum. Spectrum is a resource that, by and large, we generally control. We have a responsibility to use that in a responsible way. So there's a set of things that we should just, obviously, keep our house in order and use the resources that we directly control in a way that's consistent with the objectives that we're espousing for the sector. Thirdly, we're trying to focus on platforms that are enabling for lots of other sectors. So I would say the internet, for example, for all the merits and demerits of the open internet, the objective is, if you view the internet as an enabling technology for many, many other sectors, for many areas of the economy, it makes a lot of sense to focus on keeping that as an open platform where people can innovate, where people can invest. Spectrum, getting, for example, Spectrum out there licensed or unlicensed, ensuring that there's enough out there to use as a platform for people to innovate and invest and compete, very, very important. So focus on platforms. And then the final thing I'll say that we're doing is we're really making a very, very conscious effort to listen to as many stakeholders as we can, get out there and not just listen to the people who come in and talk to us, but go out and talk to entrepreneurs, talk to investors, talk to the capital markets, talk to the people who don't normally come and talk to us, so that as we're thinking about making our decisions even though it's a bit of a cliche, a fact-based and data-driven way, that we're trying to incorporate different perspectives and trying to do our best along the dimensions of jobs and innovation and investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Next is Phil Weiser from the White House. Phil and I have actually worked together, I'm the same employee, but we worked together for The Rock. And I will leave it at that and hope you misinterpret what I say.
Anyone know what he's talking about? This is going back to U.S. West days. There was a regional oversight committee. One thing I was able to do, it was, I have to say, definitely one of a number of high points in public service was working on a performance assurance plan involving Quest entry into long distance. For a few people, this is like a blast from the past, right, to hear those words, right? The RBOC entry in long distance, performance assurance plans. But what was valuable about the process was trying to ask the question, what really matters in enabling competition, and how would you try to assure performance post then RBOC entry into long distance? And this is a challenge for regulation because the legacy culture was prescriptive before the fact, you have to ask permission for everything, as opposed to how do you have an after the fact enforcement culture which addresses issues that might arise after the fact. And that legacy change, which RBOC entry long distance is a little bit of a pivot from one world to another, is still one of the culture changes we're in. So I'll come back to that, George, in my talk, but it's a fond memory, so thank you for reminding me. I want to thank George and Larry and the Phoenix Center. This is a great set of discussions, a great number of people who hear. I appreciate in government now, even more than I did on the outside, the role that such forums play, and thank you for your kind words about Silicon Flatirons. Also, Paul Desai, I have to say publicly, I haven't had the chance to say it yet, but I can now. When Julius told me he was bringing a McKinsey guy to be head of the OSP, I thought, wait, that's a post for an academic, not a guy from McKinsey. And I have to say how wrong I was. Paul's value of bringing sort of business savvy to the FCC is something that I hope remains as an institution after he's gone, because it's not the usual type of perspective, but it adds incredible value. So it's great that he had the foresight to bring you aboard, and I hope that others who succeed Julius find a way to institutionalize that. I'd like to see an academic thinker also, but don't get me wrong. I think Stuart Benjamin playing a role, scholar in residence, was part of that, and having a chief economist like John Baker is another part of it. So I think that's something I wanted to be able to acknowledge. Also, I don't know if Michael Mandel remembers this, but we had a conference when I was at Silicon Flatirons with Rob Atkinson on innovation policy next administration. And Michael asked one of the great questions that has been haunting me ever since, and this discussion is reminding us of that haunt, which is, how do you sell innovation policy in terms of jobs? And that is a haunting question, because particularly for the moment we're in right now in our economy, people may say innovation sounds good, how can you be against it, but where are the jobs? And the challenge is innovation policy, as I conceive of it, is a longer term exercise. It's really more about the jobs of the future, the entrepreneurs who don't exist yet, who don't have a constituency. And so that makes innovation policy a more politically perilous task, because it's harder to come up with the narrative that provides the wind behind the sails. Something else I'll get to in my talk. And finally, one more thing I want to say, which is, Paul mentioned the FCC going out and reaching people who don't always get to the FCC. That is incredibly important, and it's hard to do because the urgencies and exigencies of today's challenges and people want to talk to you make it hard to do that. So I had the pleasure a couple weeks ago on the first ever National Entrepreneurs Day with Anish Chopra, our Chief Technology Officer, and Steve Case, the chair of our National Advisory Board on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, to have essentially a visit with some local DC entrepreneurs. And one of the ideas that came from that discussion, which we've been having about our interagency discussions about how do we help facilitate entrepreneurship and our export initiatives, someone says, I'm an emerging company with a product on the web, and I'm selling all over the world, and I'm worried that I may not be complying with regulations that I need to. And we're like, boy, that's something that, we have a administration in commerce who could be trying to help those companies, but may not have actually known the problem existed. And our ability to learn of that and then have government play a constructive role there is the sort of benefit that can come from those discussions and outreach. So let me get to the main points I want to make, and there are three of them. I want to talk a little bit how we are going about innovation policy in the Obama administration. Talk a little bit more about the role of this government policy shift for the internet age, from sort of before the fact prescriptive regulation to after the fact enforcement, as well as government as convener. And then third, government as a strategic investor and how that plays a role in catalyzing innovation and investment. So first off, innovation policy. How many people here have seen the Obama strategy for American innovation that came out last fall? All right, so if we get like 3 hands in this crowd, we are clearly not serving ourselves well. Did you raise your hand, Michael, by the way? All right, so this is a problem in innovation policy, is it is not easy to get the message through. Let me give you the high points, and then hopefully a few of you will be inspired to go back and read the document. If you have thoughts and comments, I'd welcome your feedback. The premise is conceptualized as a pyramid, although you could talk about it as 3 pillars because there is an interactivity there. Government plays a role setting the foundation for innovation. So societies that innovate effectively have a few key foundational support. You could think of them probably, obvious. Infrastructure. Having a first-class infrastructure, broadband and wireless spectrum are key parts of it, give you the ability to be at the bleeding edge of technological revolutions. Number 2, educated workforce is also a critical enabler because, to start companies, invent technologies, you need good infrastructure and often smart people, and then you can be off to the races. I wouldn't end there because I also think basic research and R&D play a critical role in the overall ecosystem. And that's even more critical for government now that we don't have institutions like Bell Labs and Xerox PARC, which played such an important role in generations past. So having the right foundation that government can play a key role as a steward of is part one. Part two is having a competitive market for entrepreneurs, and that would include intellectual property rights, and that would include an ability to operate. And our commitment to the rule of law in this country, for example, our ability for investors to raise money, is all part of what has enabled this country to be a leader in technological revolutions and made us the envy of the world. And finally, an ability to identify national priorities where government is able to, again, set out challenges and opportunities. Our lead in aerospace was in part by setting out the frontier. Health IT is another area we are saying we need to go to that frontier, and the same in other areas too, clean energy being a notable example. So that's the broad brush on innovation policy. People have questions, we can talk more specifics. Number two, how to think about government's role in an internet age. And again, the metaphor back to sort of the, Barbach into the long distance. There had been an era where companies were told, don't do anything unless we give you permission first. That's not synonymous with dynamism or innovation. In fact, quite the opposite. And for those who want one of the perils of that, you might go back and read Tom Hazlitt's article on the wireless craze, which talked about how in Spectrum, that type of, as Michael Powell put it, mother may I world led to all sorts of what economists call rent-seeking disasters. One of the more painful ones involving the inventor of FM radio. Anyone know the story about Edwin Armstrong? I don't think it's at all apocryphal, but he actually, a Columbia University professor, what we want to see in innovation, right? A professor who comes up with a great new technology, and he patented it. He was ready to commercialize it. So far, we're sounding like this is a great success story. But what happened was the people who had AM radio went to the FCC and said, don't allow any spectrum to be used for FM radio. And they succeeded in stalling long enough that his patents expired before he could actually commercialize the technology, and he ended up committing suicide penniless. So that is not an entrepreneurial success story, needless to say, and is not a system that invites innovation, because what do the entrepreneurs who would follow instead say, you know what, I'll just stick to my laboratory, thank you very much. Because, and in countries around the world, this is a major problem. People come up with a great invention, and as soon as this starts to take off, the government or the incumbent, telco says, oh, we'll take a huge piece of that, thank you very much. And that is death to the entrepreneurial spirit. You don't get the next Google, Facebook, what have you, in that sort of environment. So government playing a role that allows freedom for dynamism for both entrants and incumbents is critical. Part of that, though, is you need to be able to figure out what principles really matter, back to the challenge of performance assurance plan in that case, or open internet in another case, and then be able and willing to enforce them. And one of the challenges that we need more attention is on the institutional side, because enforcement in this world hasn't been the legacy. It has been more of this command and control. And so how do you make that shift? In testimony today that I would encourage you all to read, Danny Weitzner is talking about privacy, which is another context, and he outlines that you've got these three basic models: this prescriptive before the fact, after the fact enforcement, and finally, government as convener. Government can play a role facilitating best practice, underscoring norms, creating an environment where users are more educated, and that is often underappreciated. But if you look at, again, NTIA, Danny's boss, Larry Strickling, he gave a speech called Internet Policy 3.0, where he outlines some of the premises of this. Finally, government is a strategic investor. The government can play a role in directing and development to help some emerging technologies blossom and catalyze further innovation. Three areas, quick mention, and then I'll sit down. Health IT. This is an enormously important opportunity because the legacy system in this area has undermined what is everyone's vision of a huge win for better quality care, lower cost care, and just a more sort of customer-friendly experience where people's medical records don't end up getting, literally buried in files, inaccessible, and then not there for them when they need them. And with personalized medicine as an emerging opportunity, electronic health records are even more important because more information about you that will be knowable from your genome can be available to doctors. By the way, this all does underscore, as our laws appreciate, the critical role of privacy in this context as well. Next is smart grid. The electric world is, some have said, where the telecom world was 1978. The networks have not been opened up to innovation. They are largely controlled by a single company and haven't experienced the revolution of information and communication technology. That is changing. And how government can play a role as a change agent, as a facilitator, fits in some of what I talked about earlier, being a convener, helping to facilitate a new standards development, which is something NIST is doing in this area, and provide strategic investments to help lead the frontier as these new technologies are being tested, developed, and evaluated. And finally, and quickly, educational technology. Blair's comment about digital textbooks, other developments here are all a frontier that is ahead of us that can provide huge improvements as we take on a national imperative of improving the quality of our educational system. So thank you all very much. Look forward to any questions.
Well, that was great. I suspect we may have a few questions. I don't know what we're still waiting, so let's take questions until that comes around. I was interested in the idea of having an academic in charge of OSP. I was doing some casual reading, which is something I never do, over Thanksgiving, a book called The Short History of Nearly Everything. I don't know if people have read that, but I kind of like to do a little science when I'm not doing economics, which some people don't think is science. But they were talking about the evolution of the theory of plate tectonics and how this was developed in academics, and they finally came up with a theory, and they thought about it, and then the scientific community embraced it finally after much fighting. And it turns out that the geologists who were drilling oil wells had been making the calculations about the crust moving for decades. But as the author said, the geologists that work for the oil companies don't write papers. So it is good, I think, every now and then to have somebody that steps out of academics and views the interesting problems as not the same sort of interest that the academic mind has, which can get pretty far out there. But I've had conversations with Paul. He's a very bright guy, and I think he adds a lot to the Commission's thinking. We will take some questions if there are any. If not, I will ask a few. Okay, good.
Thanks. I love my jobs at the university. Actually, two questions. One on innovation policy in general. Often the first order effects of new innovation is to improve technology in order to save labor. So at least the initial results is not to increase employment, but the initial result is to create job profits. There are secondary effects which you might want to talk about that are supposed to respond to that. So that's one question. How do you develop innovation policy in a context where the major problem that we're facing right now as a country is 10% employment, as far as the eye can see? And the second one, there was this investment as part of the stimulus program in broadband that was directed by the Commerce Department and rural electrification groups. Has there been any assessment of the job creation that was resulting from those government investments?
I'm happy to take crack at both parts. The second one is most of that money hasn't even been spent yet. So it's going to be a while. And that's one of the challenges also is longer term investments. People are like, okay, tell me what happened. What'd you get for it? Like, well, actually, we've selected who the money's going to go to. They're starting construction now. We'll come back to you in 5 years. And NHA did give a grant for someone to do what you just said. and it's an important task. I think it was people talked about the panel, which is this is really hard and it's really important to do, and it's an area that academics can provide enormous value in trying to grapple with how do we measure and come up with metrics. It's a fraud exercise because if you under-measure it, you end up telling a wrong story. And I think the point about telecoms is good on that.
Let me address the question about jobs and innovation. Actually, I think that what we've seen is that true innovation actually creates jobs contemporaneously. And that I did a paper, it had the title Jobs and Communications Boom in it. I can't remember the exact title. That if you look at the broad communications sector, including the innovation in this ecosystem, including the apps developers and the internet companies like Google and so forth, what you see is a vibrant sector which is in fact adding jobs right now. Part of what confuses things, and it's actually easier to kind of go back to the 1990s to sort of explain this. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that the information revolution created jobs at that point. But what people don't remember is if you go back to the early 90s, IBM and digital equipment were shucking hundreds of thousands of jobs at that point. So you sort of generally have two different trends going on at the same time that you've got to sort out. The innovation is creating new jobs. At the same time, the industry is restructuring itself. So I think what I would say is that if you get cutting edge innovation that in fact creates new products and new demand, that you get the jobs contemporaneously, and that's part of the test. Now it becomes very hard to measure it because these jobs don't just show up in the telecom industry; they show up in a lot of different places. And in fact, we have some data that enables us to kind of measure some of that. But I would say that it's a plus right now. It just isn't a big enough plus to overcome some of the other issues that are going on.
And let me add one point, which is another challenging implication for policy. You create new demands for new kinds of workers. So IBM suffered some number of jobs when the PC replaced the mainframe. Right? People who were mainframe specialists had to find new work. They created an enormous consulting business, helping businesses figure out how to use network PCs, store data, manage data in a different environment where local area networks were becoming sort of the norm. Now, if you were a mainframe person who had the right skill set, you could easily make the transition, you were probably fine. But if you couldn't, then you were not so fine. And that's one of the challenges for educational system. How do we prepare people for jobs of the future where you can no longer afford to be an IBM man, as it literally meant back in that mainframe day, where all you did was sold mainframes. You need to be a much more skilled, multifaceted worker who's going to work for not just one company, but maybe numerous companies over the course of your career. And that's a fundamental different economic dynamic that, at some level, is just a lot more anxiety producing because you've got to be able to adapt constantly. I think the economy is better off if it can be more flexible and adaptable, but it requires the right sort of both mentality and skill set, lest it leaves lots of people dislocated.
Okay. I want to add just one more thing, since this is since jobs was somewhere in the title there. If you look, you can actually see demand in certain occupations that are communications related have bounced back to higher levels than they were before the downturn. And so you can see, in fact, the gains. The question is the mismatch and the size of the mismatch and whether or not the overall demand can rise high enough to sort of pull people in, which is what it did in the 90s.